The summer of 1943 smelled of burned metal. From the Baltic to the Black Sea, a line of more than 3,000 kilometers separated two worlds. To the west, the Reich that promised to last 1,000 years. To the east, an army that had buried its dead by the millions and kept advancing. The Red Army was not the same one that had been crushed in 1941. Its commanders had learned through blood and fire what no academy teaches. Its soldiers knew defeat with a brutal intimacy, and that defeat had turned them into something different, patient, methodical, willing to die in quantities that no other power in the war could sustain. What follows is the story of how that army traveled more than 2,000 kilometers in 22 months. From the plains of Kursk to the ruins of the Reichstag, 10 million Soviet casualties, 9 million Germans fallen or captured on the Eastern Front, a reconquest of proportions that history had not seen since the Napoleonic Wars, and that it would never see again. This is not a story of abstract heroes. It is the story of concrete decisions, of generals with specific names and ranks, of divisions that bleed until they disappear and are replaced by others, of cities that change hands amidst mud and snow. It is the story of the real price of victory. Before continuing, I want to show you something that I think is especially worthwhile if you are a true World War II enthusiast. Over the past few months, we have been working on a collection dedicated exclusively to one of the most impressive episodes of the conflict, the Battle of Berlin in 1945. We have brought together more than 200 historical photographs, unpublished or very rarely seen, organized in a photographic collection that allows you to visually retrace the last days of the Third Reich. It's not just the same images that appear over and over again in documentaries. We've looked for lesser-known photographs showing the streets of Berlin, soldiers, vehicles, destroyed buildings, and scenes captured during those decisive days in 1945. The turning point, Kursk, July 1943. Kursk was a trap that both sides saw clearly. The Soviet salient at Kursk had an almost circular shape, approximately 250 kilometers wide and 180 deep, thrusting into the German lines like a fist buried in a wall. German planners had been looking at that salient on maps for months. The tactical solution was obvious even to a first-year military academy student. Two massive armored attacks from the north and south converging in the center to close the pocket and destroy everything inside. That operation received the code name Citadel, Unternehmen Zitadelle. The problem was that the Soviets saw it too. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, representative of the Stavka, the Soviet High Command, was the first to argue clearly to Stalin, in April 1943, that the right move was not to attack. It was to wait, to let the Germans exhaust themselves against defenses prepared over months and then counterattack with fresh, concentrated forces. It was an idea that required extraordinary discipline, having the tactical initiative and choosing not to use it. Stalin agreed. It was the first time in the war that the Soviet dictator explicitly approved a deliberate defensive strategy before a German offensive. What followed was one of the most exhaustive defensive preparations of World War II. Between April and July 1943, Soviet engineers built 8 successive defensive lines in the Kursk salient. Every kilometer of the front was sown with an average of 3,200 mines. Anti-tank positions were designed in a grid, with interlocking fields of fire covering every angle of approach. Every rifle company facing the enemy had at least 3 direct artillery pieces, 9 anti-tank guns, a tank or self-propelled gun, and a platoon of combat engineers within its position. Telephone and radio communication systems were checked and rechecked with daily fire control exercises. General Konstantin Rokossovsky's Central Front covered the northern sector, facing General Walter Model's German 9th Army. General Nikolai Vatutin's Voronezh Front covered the southern sector, facing Colonel General Hermann Hoth's 4th Panzer Army and Army Detachment Kempf. Behind both, General Ivan Konev's Steppe Front waited with more than 573,000 men in strategic reserve, ready to intervene in any direction. Total Soviet force in the Kursk salient area exceeded 1.9 million men, with more than 5,000 operational tanks and nearly 3,000 aircraft. The Germans mobilized 50 divisions for the operation, including 19 armored and motorized divisions, equipped with 2,451 tanks and assault guns and supported by more than 1,800 aircraft. The attack began on July 5, 1943. But the Soviets knew almost to the minute. Thanks to an aerial reconnaissance network, infiltration units in the German rear, and intelligence from partisans coordinated from the central headquarters of partisan movements in Moscow, the Soviet command detected final preparations. 30 minutes before the German artillery began, the Soviets launched their own counter-preparation artillery fire on enemy concentration areas. The German 9th Army artillery commander reported afterward that many of his gunners were hit out in the open, preparing to fire their own bombardment. The Luftwaffe had tactical radar. Therefore, the preemptive Soviet airstrikes failed to destroy advanced German airfields, although Soviet Air Force units suffered considerable losses in that first exchange. In the northern sector, Model attacked with the 9th Army along a 50-kilometer front against the positions of the Soviet 13th and 70th Armies. In 6 days of combat, with heavy Stuka aircraft support, the 9th Army penetrated 8 to 15 kilometers into the Central Front's defenses. Only that. 15 kilometers in 6 days against defenses that had 8 lines of depth. Model lost up to 400 tanks and 50,000 casualties. On July 12th, the German attack in the north came to a complete halt. In the south, the situation was more dangerous for the Soviets. Hoth's 4th Panzer Army had its best units. The 2nd SS Panzer Corps, with the Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, Das Reich and Totenkopf divisions, totaling 364 tanks, including 42 Tigers, and the powerful 48th Panzer Corps with the Grossdeutschland division, carrying almost all available Panthers, 200 units grouped in the 10th Panzer Brigade. On Hoth's right flank, Army Detachment Kempf carried the 3rd Panzer Corps with 3 armored divisions and a separate detachment of 45 Tigers. These units penetrated up to 35 kilometers into the Soviet defenses, reaching the 3rd defensive belt. They were only stopped by General Mikhail Katukov's 1st Guards Tank Army and other Soviet mechanized formations that used an unusual tactic. They buried the tanks in defensive positions while launching uninterrupted counterattacks against the German flanks. Reducing the exposure of Soviet armor meant that the technical advantages of the Tigers and Panthers were partially nullified. The critical point arrived on July 11th and 12th at the Prokhorovka railway station. General Pavel Rotmistrov advanced the 5th Guards Tank Army, released from Konev's Steppe Front, 100 kilometers in night marches to attack positions. His plan was to charge at close range against the 2nd SS Panzer Corps, where the guns of both sides had real chances of penetrating the adversary's armor. On July 12th, the 18th and 29th Tank Corps executed that suicidal charge across undulating open terrain. Rotmistrov lost up to 400 of the 500 tanks that attacked, against a German force of fewer than 200 vehicles. Post-war studies, based on declassified Soviet documents, established that the Battle of Prokhorovka involved 306 German and 672 Soviet tanks, far from the mythical figures of 1,200 to 1,500 vehicles that dominated popular narratives for decades. But Soviet sacrifices stopped the 2nd SS Panzer Corps almost dead in its tracks by July 13th. 3 days earlier, on July 10, 1943, the Western Allies had landed in Sicily. Hitler cancelled Operation Citadel. On July 18th, the 4th Panzer Army and Army Detachment Kempf began a fighting retreat toward their starting positions. Kursk was the first time in the war that a major German offensive failed to penetrate enemy defenses to operational depths, but that was only the first part of a larger failure. Kutuzov and Rumyantsev, the counterattack. The Germans had no time to recover. On the very same July 12th that Model's attack collapsed in the north, the Red Army launched its own planned offensive against the Oral salient, the geographical counterpart of the Kursk salient. The operation was named Kutuzov, in honor of the marshal who had defeated Napoleon. Colonel General Vasily Sokolovsky's Western Front, Colonel General Markian Popov's Bryansk Front, and later Rokossovsky's Central Front attacked from the north, east and south of the German salient. General Ivan Bagramian's 11th Guards Army, which had concentrated 170,500 men, 648 tanks, and more than 3,100 pieces of artillery with almost no detection, created a penetration on the first day. General Pavel Rybalko's 3rd Guards Tank Army pushed deep into the German rear on July 14th. In the south of the Orel salient, Colonel General Lothar Rendulic, commanding the 35th Army Corps, had correctly predicted the Soviet attack point and skillfully concentrated his scarce resources, managing to hold out for 2 additional days. He was the exception. On August 5th, the 3rd Guards Tank Army entered Orel. By August 18th, the Bryansk front had reached the outskirts of the city that gave it its name, completely eliminating the German salient. While Kutuzov was unfolding, Manstein gathered his armoured reserves, including the 2nd SS, 24th and 38th Panzer Corps, in the Donbas area to contain secondary attacks. This left the southern flank of the Kursk salient unprotected just as the Soviets launched Operation Rumyantsev. The new offensive involved Vatutin's Voronezh front and Konev's Steppe front, attacking from the southern shoulder of the Battle of Kursk, the very sector where the German penetration had been deepest. A fictitious tank army and a combined arms army were simulated to the west through false radio signals and artificial troop movements to distract German attention. The actual attacks of August 3, 1943, concentrated forces to create unusual artillery densities. Each attacking division received enough artillery to form specialized groups of several support battalions for the attacking infantry regiments. On August 5th, late on the 3rd day of Operation Rumyantsev, the advanced elements of the tank armies were finally unleashed to exploit the German rear. That evening, Belgorod fell. The 2 tank armies achieved a depth of more than 60 kilometers behind the initial German lines. Manstein gathered 4 infantry divisions and 7 armoured or motorized divisions to counterattack. The former divisions of the 2nd SS Panzer Corps, now under the control of the 3rd Panzer Corps, its original headquarters having departed for Italy following the Allied invasion of Sicily, tried to use the same maneuver schemes they had employed when capturing Kharkov 5 months before, but this time it was the Germans who were exhausted and overextended. 3 days of fluid combat around the town of Bogodukhov, northwest of Kharkov, concluded on August 16th and 17th when the 3rd Panzer Corps managed to stabilize the situation, but only by pushing the 6th Guards Army and the remnants of the 1st Panzer Army back to the Merchik River. The Germans had not completely destroyed the Soviet mechanized forces. On August 28th, Konev's Steppe front captured Kharkov. It was the 4th and final Battle of Kharkov. The Germans would never return. Kursk and the operations that followed marked something definitive. The strategic initiative on the Eastern Front had changed hands, never to return again. After Kursk, Germany could launch local counterattacks. It could delay, but it could no longer decide when and where the next battle would be fought. The race to the Dnieper, August to November 1943. In August 1943, Stalin and the Stavka ordered a general offensive along the entire front for the third time in the war. The objective was the Dnieper River. From Smolensk to the Black Sea, 4 Soviet army groups pushed westward in a broad succession of attacks. In the north, the reconquest was slow and costly. The Germans had spent up to 18 months building defenses facing Army Group Center, and the wooded and swampy terrain of Belarus and the Smolensk region amplified the defenders' advantage. The offensive toward Smolensk, named Suvorov, began on August 7th, but the defenders were tenacious, and German aerial reconnaissance detected the main Soviet effort despite hurried attempts at deception. The city did not fall until late September, with considerable losses. In the south, the advance was spectacular. General Malinovsky's southwestern front and General Tolbukin's southern front struck the Donbass on August 16th and 18th, respectively. The German 1st Panzer Army and the reconstituted 6th Army avoided encirclement and carried out a month-long retreat to the Panther Line. But throughout September, the Soviet fronts approached the Dnieper like a tide. The Germans believed the river would save them. The western banks of the Dnieper are generally higher than the eastern ones, giving the defender artillery advantages, and the Dnieper is a serious obstacle, 550 to 800 meters wide at many points, with a fast current. But the Red Army reached the river before the Germans could organize it as a defensive position. Between September 19th and 26th, 1943, the advanced elements of Vatutin's Voronezh front reached the Dnieper north and south of Kiev. Despite lacking adequate pontoon equipment, Soviet units improvised 40 crossing points between September 19th and 26th. In one of the most daring episodes of the war, General Alexander Kravchenko led his 5th Guards Tank Corps across several rivers through the dangerous expedient of sealing the T-34s as best as possible and crossing the watercourses at maximum speed. The Corps commander reported laconically that he had managed to cross the majority of his vehicles. Dozens of tanks and crews undoubtedly sank into the mud of the watercourses. The airborne support attempt for the bridgeheads south of Kiev was a disaster. On the night of September 24th to 25th, 2 Soviet airborne brigades were supposed to jump near the large Veliki Bukrin bridgehead. What the planners did not know was that 5 German divisions, 2 armored, 2 infantry and 1 motorized, were in transit toward the drop zone, with elements of the 19th Panzer Division already in place. The paratroopers were scattered over the drop zone and decimated by the unexpected defense. The failure convinced Stalin not to use large-scale airborne operations for the rest of the war. Vatutin changed tactics. Instead of the Veliki Bukrin bridgehead south of Kiev, he turned his attention to a small bridgehead in the marshes north of the city, at the village of Lyutezh. It was so impassable that the Germans, with their front overextended, had not assigned major forces to contain it. On October 11th, Vatutin sent General Kravchenko's 5th Guards Tank Corps to reinforce it. In October, the Voronezh front was redesignated as the 1st Ukrainian Front. Vatutin secretly transferred Rybalko's entire 3rd Guards Tank Army, along with significant infantry and artillery, to the tight bridgehead. On November 3rd, 1943, the 38th Army and Rybalko's tank army surged out of the bridgehead, overwhelming the surprised German defenders. 3 days later, Vatutin's troops recaptured Kiev. November 6, 1943, was the first Soviet national holiday after the liberation of Kiev. The capital of Ukraine had been under German occupation since September 19, 1941. What followed was a series of maneuver combats in which Manstein tried to repeat his triumph of the previous February, when he had destroyed the majority of 3 Soviet armies in a brilliant counter-offensive south of Kharkov and failed every time. Zhytomyr fell, then the Soviets recaptured it, then the Soviets retook it definitively. The German tank divisions carried out counterattacks that achieved local successes but could not completely destroy the Soviet mechanized force. By Christmas 1943, Manstein launched a final attempt to eradicate the dangerous bridgehead. Believing he had destroyed 4 Soviet corps near Korostyshiv, he learned on December 25th that he had attacked a deception force while a powerful Soviet shock group was gathering further south in the Brusilov area. The next day, the 1st Panzer Army and the 1st Guards Army advanced westward from Kiev. Toward the end of 1943, the Red Army had crossed the Dnieper at multiple points. The wall that the Germans had called the Ostwall, the East Wall, had been pierced before they could build it. The devastating winter, Korsun-Cherkasy, January-February 1944. At the beginning of 1944, the Stavka had 3 simultaneous priorities in the south: to exploit the Dnieper bridgeheads, to eliminate the dangerous German salient at Nikopol, which still maintained a bridgehead on the eastern bank, and to destroy or capture the German forces trapped in the Korsun-Cherkasy salient. The Korsun salient was a protrusion of the German line that jutted eastward between the 1st and 2nd Ukrainian fronts. The divisions defending it were vulnerable to a classic double envelopment. On January 24, 1944, General Rotmistrov's 5th Guards Tank Army from Konev's 2nd Ukrainian Front and the 6th Tank Army of the 1st Ukrainian Front attacked the bases of the salient. On January 28th, the 2 spearheads linked up at Zvenigorodka, trapping the German divisions of the 11th and 42nd Army Corps, approximately 60,000 men, in a pocket that the Germans called a cauldron, Kessel, and the Soviets simply referred to as the Korsun Bag. Manstein organized a relief effort with 4 Panzer Corps. General Breith's 3rd Panzer Corps, with the 1st, 16th, 17th and SS Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler divisions, launched the main effort. Konev built a defensive belt 15 kilometers deep facing the relief forces while his forces continued to compress the encirclement from the inside. The combat lasted until February 16th and 17th. On the night of February 16th to 17th, the trapped troops attempted a mass breakout. Cis General Herbert Giller led the survivors of the Wiking Division outward in night marches through snow and mud. General Stemmermann, who commanded the trapped forces, was killed during the breakout. The most widely accepted calculations indicate that between 30,000 and 35,000 men survived and reached German lines. The rest, some 20,000 to 25,000 Germans, died or were taken prisoner. Artillery and heavy equipment were completely abandoned in the winter mud. Konev's 2nd Ukrainian Front captured 18,200 prisoners. Konev was promoted to Marshal of the Soviet Union. The winter of 1943 to 1944 consumed huge numbers of men on both sides. Along the southern front, the Ukrainian fronts, 4 in total, continually pushed west and south. The 1st Ukrainian Front reached the Polish border on January 4, 1944. The 3rd Ukrainian Front liberated Dnipropetrovsk on October 25, 1943, and advanced toward Odessa. General Tolbukin's 4th Ukrainian Front pierced the German Panther Line on October 11, 1943, and isolated the German 17th Army in Crimea. The German retreat in the south was not an elegant tactical withdrawal. It was a fighting rout, with divisions replacing losses with recruits who had not finished their training, staffs losing track of their units in the confusion of night movements, and a Hitler who kept ordering the retention of indefensible positions. On April 10, 1944, Odessa was liberated. Free Leningrad and the fall of Crimea, January to May 1944. To the north, the winter of 1944 brought its own liberation. Leningrad had been under siege since September 1941, almost 900 days. The city had lost more than 1 million civilians, most of them to starvation. In the winter of 1941 to 1942, the daily bread ration for a female civilian worker had dropped to 125 grams. Lake Ladoga was the only connection to the outside world. The road of life, over which trucks loaded with food crossed the ice under German fire. On January 14, 1944, Marshal Leonid Govorov's Leningrad Front and General Kirill Meretskov's Volkhov Front launched the Leningrad-Novgorod offensive. In the south, General Markian Popov's Second Baltic Front attacked simultaneously to pin down the reserves of Army Group North. The offensive used techniques that had become characteristic of the mature Red Army of 1944, reinforced reconnaissance groups that infiltrated German positions during the early nights, massive fire superiority concentrated in narrow sectors, and exploitation by mobile forces as soon as the penetration was created. On January 19th, the Leningrad Front captured Krasnoye Selo and Pushkin. On January 27, 1944, Stalin authorized an artillery salute of 24 salvos from 324 guns in Leningrad, the same ceremonial reserved for major victories. The siege was over. The German Army Group North retreated westward and southward, and on January 20th, Novgorod was liberated by the forces of the Volkhov Front. By April 1944, the front had stabilized along the line of the Narva River and Lake Peipus, with the Germans still holding Estonia and Latvia. But the longest siege of World War II was over. In the south, Crimea was the next objective. The German 17th Army, composed mainly of Romanian and German divisions, had been isolated on the peninsula since October 1943, when the 4th Ukrainian Front cut the Perekop Isthmus. Hitler refused to evacuate Crimea despite repeated requests from his field commanders. According to the Führer, holding Crimea had political and strategic value, preventing Turkey from entering the war on the Allied side and preserving access to the Black Sea. On April 8, 1944, General Fyodor Tolbukin's 4th Ukrainian Front attacked across the Perekop Isthmus with the 51st Army and the 2nd Guards Army, while the 2nd Guards Army crossed the Sivash Strait. On April 11th, troops from General Andrei Eremenko's separate coastal army of Crimea landed on the Kerch Peninsula. Sevastopol, the naval fortress that had resisted for 8 months in 1941 to 1942, fell on May 9, 1944. According to Soviet records, the German 17th Army lost more than 100,000 men killed or captured. Some 38,000 were evacuated by sea. But the Kriegsmarine and the Luftwaffe lost dozens of ships and dozens of aircraft in the process during Soviet attacks throughout the evacuation. Hitler had lost Crimea by the same principle that would lose him Belarus 2 months later, the refusal to retreat when retreat was still possible. Bagration, the death of Army Group Center, June to August 1944. June 22, 1944 marked the 3rd anniversary of the German invasion. The coincidence was not accidental. Operation Bagration, named after the Georgian prince and Russian General Pyotr Bagration, a hero of the Napoleonic Wars, was the largest Soviet attack of the war up to that point. It was also one of the most elaborately prepared and deceptive campaigns any army had executed in the entire Second World War. The German Army Group Center defended Belarus along a front of nearly 600 kilometers. In theory, it had 63 divisions. In practice, the constant bleeding toward the Ukrainian front and the requirements of the war in other theaters had completely hollowed out those divisions. A typical German infantry division defended a 32-kilometer sector, far beyond what any defense in depth could allow. Only 4 divisions were available as operational reserves behind a 600-kilometer front. The 20th Panzer Division, the strongest among those reserves, was controlled by the OKH, not by the Army Group. Field Marshal Ernst Busch, commander of Army Group Center, had tried in May 1944 to persuade Hitler to withdraw forces to the Dnieper or Berezina rivers to create operational reserves. Hitler rejected both proposals. Worse still, in May, he designated the main railway nodes of Vitebsk, Orsha, Mogilev and Bobruisk as fortress cities that had to be defended to the last man. These fortress cities would be filled with troops that Hitler imagined as defensive pivots but were actually traps for his own soldiers. Soviet deception, maskirovka, was the most brilliant part of the plan. Under the direction of Colonel General Alexei Antonov in the General Staff, the deception campaign portrayed a continuous emphasis on the Ukrainian front and limited attacks facing Army Group Center. 5 complete armies, including the 5th Guards Tank Army, the 8th Guards Tank Army, the 6th Guards Tank Army and the 11th Guards Army, were secretly transferred from the south to positions facing Belarus. Colonel Reinhard Gehlen, head of the OKH's Fremde Heere Ost intelligence service, kept predicting until the day of the attack that the main Soviet offensives would be in the northern and southern flanks. His analysts failed to detect the arrival of 3 combined arms armies, a tank army, and several mobile corps facing Army Group Center. On the night of June 19th to 20th, partisans launched a wave of coordinated attacks against transport nodes throughout the rear of Army Group Center. On that single night, more than 1,000 transport nodes were disabled, making any rapid repositioning of German reserves impossible. The force ratio at the moment of the attack was as follows. The Soviets assembled 1,254,300 men, 4,070 tanks and self-propelled guns, 24,383 artillery pieces, and 5,327 combat aircraft against 336,573 men, 495 tanks and 2,589 German artillery pieces. 13-1 in artillery, 8-1 in tanks, 8-1 in aircraft. Reconnaissance operations began on June 21st and 22nd. Reinforced battalions infiltrated German positions in the darkness, often capturing frontline defenses without firing a shot. In many sectors, the planned artillery preparation was cancelled because reconnaissance had been so successful that it would be a waste. The main attack began on June 23rd. In the Vitebsk sector, Lieutenant General Afanasy Beloborodov's 43rd Army crossed the West Dvina River west of the city. By noon on June 25th, it had linked up with the advanced detachments of the 39th Army, cutting off the retreat routes of the 53rd Army Corps. Vitebsk was encircled, and the 53rd Corps, 4 divisions, capitulated. In the south of the front, Rokossovsky began the attack of the 1st Belarusian Front on June 24th. His engineers had secretly built corduroy roads across the swamps along the eastern side of the Ptich River, undetected by the defenders. Vanguard units emerged from the swamps almost miraculously and crushed the surprised German positions. By noon on June 25th, Lieutenant General Panov's 1st Guards Tank Corps had penetrated more than 40 kilometers to the southern approaches of Bobruisk. The 20th Panzer Division, the only operational reserve, spent 2 days moving in circles in response to contradictory orders, unable to determine whether the main attack was coming from Rogachev to the east or from south of Bobruisk. Meanwhile, Lieutenant General Bakarov's 9th Tank Corps broke free from the German defences west of Rogachev and raced west to capture the Berezina crossings south of Bobruisk. Simultaneously, the 1st Guards Tank Corps did the same on the western bank of the river. The Soviet lightning strike of General Rotmistrov's 5th Guards Tank Army, along with the 3rd Guards Mechanized Corps and the Pliev Cavalry Mechanized Group, advanced through the northern gap to the west. On July 2nd, 1944, only a handful of dug-in and battle-ready German regiments occupied Minsk and its surroundings. The fall of Minsk on July 3rd was the climax of the initial phase. The 3rd Guards Tank Corps moved toward the northwestern corner of the city. Colonel Losik's 4th Guards Tank Brigade, the mobile group of the 11th Guards Army, cleared the northeastern flank. That afternoon, the vanguard elements of the 1st Guards Tank Corps arrived from the south. The city fell into Soviet hands in a single morning before the German defense could organize. Behind the tanks came the rifle units of the 3rd Army from the southeast and the 31st Army from the northeast, establishing the internal encirclement around the elements of the German 4th Army still fighting east of Minsk. The German 4th Army, the main force of Army Group Center, was destroyed in that operational encirclement. A parable of what had happened. The Chief of Staff of the 9th Army greeted the commander of the 12th Panzer Division, who had just stepped off the train to assess the situation, with the ironic remark, "Welcome, the 9th Army no longer exists." In the 12 days between June 22nd and July 4th, 1944, Army Group Center lost 25 divisions and more than 300,000 men. In the following weeks, it would lose more than 100,000 additional men. On July 17th, 1944, Stalin ordered a parade of 57,600 German prisoners captured during Bagration through the streets of Moscow. The column took several hours to pass. Columns of grey, exhausted men, many of them wounded, marched under the guard of Soviet soldiers. The world saw what Bagration had meant, but Bagration was not over. From Lvov to the Vistula, and from the Vistula to Warsaw, July to September 1944. On July 13, 1944, Marshal Ivan Konev's First Ukrainian Front launched the Lvov-Sandomierz operation. General Johannes Friesner's Army Group North Ukraine was in slightly better condition than the destroyed Army Group Center. It had significant, although underestimated, armored forces in reserve. But Konev possessed 3 of the Red Army's 6 tank armies and 2 cavalry mechanized groups. The reconnaissance units of the 3rd Guards Army and the 13th Army found the forward German positions unoccupied on July 13th. Immediately, the vanguard battalions and main forces joined the advance, penetrating up to 15 kilometers on the first day. The most dramatic action occurred when Konev had to force his tank armies, more than 1,000 tanks and self-propelled guns, through a narrow 4-kilometer corridor in the Koltov sector. Despite determined counterattacks from the 8th and 1st Panzer Divisions, the armored armada successfully pushed through the fire. On July 18th, elements of the 3rd Guards Tank Army surrounded the German 13th Corps in the Brody Pocket, 4 division-sized units plus the 14th SS Division, and captured or destroyed the bulk of its men. Lvov was abandoned by the Germans on July 27th. Katukov's and Rybalko's tank armies turned north toward the Vistula River. On July 29th and 30th, the advanced detachments of Katukov's army and motorized elements of the 13th Army captured small bridgeheads over the Vistula south of Sandomierz. Within days, these were reinforced by the bulk of the 2 tank armies and Rybalko's army. Meanwhile, in the north center, the left wing of Rokossovsky's First Belarusian Front went into action on July 18th with the 47th Army, the 8th Guards Army, and eventually the 2nd Tank Army. By July 25th, the vanguard elements had reached the eastern bank of the Vistula. Chuikov's 8th Guards Army captured a bridgehead at Magnusiu, and the 69th Army secured another at Puławy. The 2nd Tank Army turned north toward Warsaw. What followed was one of the most controversial episodes of the final stages of the war in Europe. On August 1st, 1944, General Tadeusz Komorowski's Polish Home Army rose in arms in Warsaw. The Polish leaders believed the Red Army was about to enter the city. They wanted to liberate it before the Soviet arrival to assert their political legitimacy before the world and the government in exile in London. But the 2nd Tank Army was exhausted. On July 30th, the 3rd Tank Corps northeast of Warsaw was crushed by counterattacks from the Hermann Göring Corps and the 19th Panzer Division. By August 2nd and 3rd, the 4th Panzer Division and the 5th SS Panzer Division Woking added their strength and severely damaged the 3rd Tank Corps, also pressing the 8th Guards Tank Corps. On August 5th, the 2nd Tank Army was withdrawn for refitting. The Warsaw Uprising lasted 63 days. The Polish insurgents died by the tens of thousands. The SS crushed the uprising neighborhood by neighborhood. The city was deliberately destroyed afterward by Hitler's order, building by building. Historians continue to debate whether the Soviets could have aided the uprising. What Red Army documents clearly show is that the 2nd Tank Army was genuinely incapacitated from renewing the attack in August, having suffered severe losses in the German counterattacks. The Soviets were also anxious to secure their Vistula bridgeheads south of Warsaw. What the archives also show is that Stalin had no interest in Komorowski's government as a political power in post-war Poland. That political calculation undoubtedly influenced the sluggishness with which air and material support was provided. The RAF and its Commonwealth allies flew long-range missions from Italy to drop weapons by parachute to Warsaw. Until mid-September, Stalin refused to authorize American planes to use Soviet airfields for similar missions. By the time the first such mission was flown on September 18th, the areas remaining in Polish hands were too small for parachute drops, and only about a fifth of the containers reached their intended recipients. Warsaw would not be liberated until January 1945. The flanks: Romania, the Baltics and Hungary, August to December 1944. In mid-August 1944, while the Soviet fronts were resting and re-equipping on the Vistula, the Stavka turned its attention to the flanks. In the south, Army Group South Ukraine defended Romania with a total force of approximately 500,000 German and 405,000 Romanian troops. The two southern Ukrainian fronts, Malinovsky's 2nd and Tolbukin's 3rd, totaled 1,314,200 men. But Guderian, in his first action as Chief of the General Staff following the failed July 20th assassination attempt, had withdrawn 5 German panzer divisions and 6 infantry divisions from the Romanian front to plug the gaps opened by Bagration. The Iași-Chișinău operation began on August 20th, 1944. In the north, General Alexei Kravchenko's 6th Tank Army entered the exploitation phase on the first day of the attack. Much of the success was due to the fact that the Romanian defenders, who formed the bulk of the attacked positions, offered only nominal resistance. Only units with local ties, such as the Romanian 14th Infantry Division, recruited around Chișinău, fought with bravery. On August 23rd, the conspirators in Bucharest acted. King Michael I arrested Marshal Antonescu and denounced the treaty that had forced Romania to ally with Germany. In response, Hitler ordered local forces to march on the capital and bomb the royal palace. This gesture gave Bucharest the pretext to declare war on Germany, which completed the destruction of the German 6th Army that was already well advanced on the battlefield. By August 29th, Army Group South Ukraine had suffered a fate similar to that of Army Group Center: destruction of the 6th Army and total collapse of the front in Romania. German and Romanian losses exceeded 400,000 men, at a cost of 67,000 Soviet casualties. Ploesti, the oil fields that had supplied Germany with much of its aviation fuel and tank gasoline, fell on September 2nd. Without Romanian oil, the Reich was doomed, but it still took 9 months to die. In the north, the final blow to Army Group North unfolded in September and October. On September 14th, the 3 Baltic fronts attacked in the direction of Riga with a combined force of 1,215,000 men, 27,373 guns, 2,341 tanks and 3,056 aircraft. On October 5th, Marshal Bagramian's 1st Baltic Front attacked westward toward the Baltic, reaching the coast on October 9th north and south of Memel, isolating the German 28th Army Corps in the encircled city and confining the bulk of Army Group North to the Courland Peninsula. Thus began the so-called Courland Pocket. Nearly 200,000 German soldiers locked in the northwestern tip of Latvia, who held out until May 9th, 1945. 6 Soviet armies kept them there for 6 months without being able to use them anywhere else. Hitler repeatedly rejected his general's suggestions to evacuate those forces for use in the defense of the Reich. Admiral Karl Donitz convinced him that controlling Courland was strategically necessary for the German Navy's submarine program. In Hungary, the Red Army tried on 3 consecutive occasions, in October, November and early December, to capture or encircle Budapest and failed each time. The German 3rd Panzer Corps, with the 1st, 13th and 23rd Panzer Divisions plus the Feldherrenhalle, repelled the Soviet assaults with losses on both sides. Only when Malinovsky and Tolbukin coordinated an attack on both sides of the capital on December 20th, 1944, did they manage to close the encirclement. By December 27th, the 2 fronts had united along the Danube west of Budapest, trapping the 9th SS Mountain Corps, 4 divisions, and 2 Hungarian divisions inside the city. The Germans would try to relieve Budapest 3 more times in January 1945. All of them failed. The Winter of Destruction, Vistula Oder, January 1945. On January 12, 1945, the Red Army launched the Vistula Oder operation. Churchill had personally asked Stalin to accelerate the offensive to ease German pressure in the Ardennes, where Hitler had launched his last major offensive in the West on December 16, 1944. Stalin responded by bringing the attack forward by 8 days from what had been planned. The force ratio on the Vistula line was overwhelming. 3 Soviet fronts, Zhukov's 1st Belarusian, Konev's 1st Ukrainian, and Rokossovsky's 2nd Belarusian, totaled more than 2.2 million men, 6,400 tanks, 46,000 artillery pieces, and 4,700 aircraft against the weakened remnants of the German Army Group A, perhaps 450,000 men with fewer than 1,000 tanks. Zhukov attacked from the Vistula bridgeheads at Magnusow and Puławy with a 25-minute artillery preparation, minimal by late Soviet standards, but calculated to surprise a defender who expected a long bombardment. Konev in the south used a longer preparation. 107 minutes of artillery fire followed by a chemical smokescreen to conceal the crossing of the Nida. The penetration was immediate and irresistible. On January 17th, Warsaw was finally liberated. The city that had crushed the uprising in August and that the Germans had systematically destroyed in retaliation was a wasteland of ruins. Estimates indicate that more than 85% of the city was deliberately demolished between the end of the August uprising and the Soviet entry in January. On January 19th, Konev's army captured Krakow, the first major Polish city taken almost intact, thanks to the fact that German forces simply could not organize for its defense before finding themselves surrounded. On January 27, 1945, troops of the 60th Guards Army of the 1st Ukrainian Front liberated Auschwitz-Birkenau. The Soviets found about 7,000 survivors inside who were too weak to be moved. The Germans had evacuated tens of thousands of prisoners on death marches in the preceding days. Soviet soldiers also found the warehouses containing the physical evidence of the extermination: hundreds of thousands of suits, tens of thousands of pairs of shoes, tons of hair. On January 31st, the advanced detachments of Zhukov's 1st Belarusian Front crossed the Oder at Kustrin, 60 kilometers from Berlin, and established a small bridgehead. The advance from the Vistula to the Oder, approximately 600 kilometers, had taken 18 days. 18 days. Army Group A had been destroyed. Numerous German divisions were simply overwhelmed and captured before they could retreat. Between January 12th and February 3rd, the 3 Soviet fronts advanced between 400 and 600 kilometers and liberated most of Poland. General Heinz Guderian, chief of the German General Staff, calculated later that the Vistula-Oder offensive was the greatest German catastrophe of the war, including Stalingrad. At Stalingrad, a portion of the Red Army had destroyed the Sixth Army. In January 1945, the entire Red Army destroyed Army Group A. East Prussia and the Flanks of Death, January to April 1945. While Zhukov and Konev advanced toward the Oder in the center, the flanks developed their own bloody campaigns. To the north, East Prussia was the nightmare that Soviet planners had foreseen months in advance. General Ivan Chernyakhovsky's 3rd Belarusian Front attacked East Prussia on January 13th with the 5th and 11th Guards Armies. Chernyakhovsky was 37 years old, the youngest front commander of the war. He had earned that reputation leading a tank corps in 1942 and the 60th Army at Kursk. Soviet intelligence estimated that the region was protected by fortifications, some of which dated back to the 19th century and had been extensively upgraded during the war years. The terrain was urbanized, with every town turned into a miniature fort. The January 13th attack managed to penetrate 11 kilometers on the first day in some sectors. By the following day, the 31st and 39th Armies joined the assault, and Colonel General Galitsky's 11th Guards Army crossed the East Prussian border. The fortifications were so formidable that it took 4 days to pierce the tactical defense. The second defensive line along the German border proved so strong that Cherniakovsky had to commit the 28th Reserve Army, but the advance as a whole stalled in the Stalopernen defensive region, combat that cost massive amounts of ammunition and lives. On February 18, 1945, General Ivan Cherniakovsky was mortally wounded by a shell splinter near Melsak. He was 37 years old and the highest-ranking Soviet general killed in combat during the war. Marshal Vasily Sokolovsky temporarily replaced him until Marshal Alexander Vasilevsky assumed command of the Third Belarusian Front. The encirclement of Königsberg, the historical capital of East Prussia, culminated on April 9, 1945, after 4 days of massive assault in which the Soviets used 5,000 guns along a 35-kilometer front. Gauleiter Erich Koch had banned the evacuation of civilians until it was too late. It is estimated that more than 100,000 German civilians died in East Prussia alone during the fighting and the fall of the 1945 winter. To the south, Budapest held out until February 13, 1945. The siege of the Hungarian capital had lasted since December 27, 1944. The garrison, approximately 45,000 Germans and 50,000 Hungarians, attempted a massive breakout on the night of February 11th to 12th. Of the 28,000 who participated in the attempt, it is estimated that no more than 700 reached German lines. General Ivan Hindi and SS Obergruppenführer Karl Pfeffer-Wildenbruch were captured. By February 13th, Budapest was in Soviet hands, but the Germans were not finished on the Hungarian front. In early March 1945, Hitler launched Operation Spring Awakening, Frühlingserwachen, at Lake Balaton, using the 4th SS Panzer Corps with the Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler and Das Reich divisions as the spearhead, along with SS Obergruppenführer Sepp Dietrich's 6th SS Panzer Army, the very units that had fought in the Ardennes. The offensive sought to recapture the region's oil fields. General Zhadov's 3rd Guards Army absorbed the blow and began to retaliate on March 16th. By April 4th, Vienna was reached by Soviet vanguard units. German attempts to hold on to Hungary and Austria in the spring of 1945 had been, at best, a painful distraction. At worst, they had consumed some of the Reich's last armored reserves in battles with no strategic exit, when those very divisions were desperately needed to defend the Oder. Berlin, April to May 1945. On April 16, 1945, at 3 a.m. Berlin time, the Berlin operation began. Zhukov's 1st Belarusian Front opened with a 20 to 30-minute artillery preparation on the 1st German defensive belt along the Oder. Then, 143 reoriented anti-aircraft searchlights illuminated the terrain in front of the attackers. The idea was to dazzle and disorient the defenders. The effect was the opposite. The dust and smoke from the artillery reflected the light back toward the attackers, leaving them literally blind in their own advance. The Silo Heights, the ridge dominating the plain west of the Oder, proved to be a more formidable obstacle than anticipated. The slope was too steep for tanks to accompany the infantry. The Hauptkanal at the foot of the heights delayed the crossing. Zhukov's 8th Guards Army, the formation designated for the main effort from the Kustrin bridgehead, made only limited progress. Zhukov made a mistake he had criticized in others. He prematurely committed his exploitation tank armies, Katukov's 1st Guards Tank Army and Bogdanov's 2nd Guards Tank Army, to complete the initial penetration that had not yet been achieved. The tank armies got bogged down in traffic and the obstacles of the rifle divisions fighting breakthrough battles for which they were not designed. On the southern flank, Konev fared much better. The 1st Ukrainian Front's artillery prepared for 107 minutes before the Neisse crossing. By the end of the first day, his infantry forces, supported by tank corps, had forced the river and penetrated the main defensive belt, driving up to 1.5 kilometers into the second belt. By the end of April 18th, the First Ukrainian Front had completely penetrated the Neisse defensive line and crossed the Spree south of Berlin, creating conditions to envelop the city from the south. On April 17th, Stalin personally called Zhukov and Konev and intentionally erased the demarcation line between their two fronts on the operational map in the Berlin zone. He had just turned the capture of the Reich capital into a competition between two marshals. On April 20th, long-range artillery of the Third Shock Army was the first to open fire on Berlin. On April 21st, intermingled units of the Third Shock Army, the 2nd Guards Tank Army, the 47th Army, the 8th Guards Army, and the 1st Guards Tank Army penetrated the capital's suburbs. Meanwhile, Konev accelerated. On April 21st, Rybalko's 3rd Guards Tank Army and Lelyushenko's 4th Guards Tank Army advanced 95 kilometers. The next day, Rybalko's vanguard elements took the OKH headquarters in Zossen, 30 kilometers south of central Berlin. Any vestige of centralized German control over operations ceased to exist. On April 24th, Chuikov's 8th Guards Army and Katukov's 1st Guards Tank Army joined the spearheads of Rybalko's 3rd Guards Tank Army and Luchinsky's 28th Army southeast of Berlin. The city was surrounded. The next day, April 25th, 1945, a rifle division of the 5th Shock Army met with elements of the 69th Infantry Division of the US 1st Army at Torgau on the Elbe. Nazi Germany was cut in two. The battle for central Berlin was an urban hell that cost the lives of tens of thousands of Soviet and German soldiers. Assault engineers blew up building walls to avoid crossing open streets. Tank, infantry, artillery, sappers teams advanced building by building. The subway system was used by both sides to move without being exposed. German tank hunters with Panzerfausts inflicted severe losses on Soviet armor in the narrow streets. On April 29th, the 79th Rifle Corps of the 3rd Shock Army began the symbolic assault on the Reichstag. On April 30th, two scouts from the 150th Rifle Division, Sergeant Mikhail Yegorov and Private Meliton Kantaria, hoisted the red banner over the building. Combat inside the Reichstag continued until the morning of May 1st as Soviet soldiers eliminated resistance groups from the basements. Also, on April 30th, in the bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery, Adolf Hitler committed suicide. The Berlin garrison, commanded by General of Artillery Helmuth Weidling, capitulated on the afternoon of May 2, 1945. Weidling went out into the street with his hands up and signed the garrison's surrender. The Battle of Berlin cost the Red Army 361,367 casualties, of which 81,116 were irretrievable, killed and missing. Chuikov's 8th Guards Army, the very divisions that had survived Stalingrad, lost 24,484 men between April 11th and May 1st alone. The Germans lost 458,000 dead in battle and 479,298 prisoners, according to figures from the three committed Soviet fronts. Prague, the last combat, May 1945. The fall of Berlin did not end the war. In Czechoslovakia, more than 600,000 men of the German Army Group Center, now under Field Marshal Ferdinand Schörner, were still fighting. On May 5, 1945, the population of Prague rose in arms against the German occupation. Schörner had orders to crush the uprising. On May 1st, the Stavka had ordered Konev's 1st Ukrainian front to turn southwest for an advance on Prague, coordinated with Malinovsky's 2nd and Eremenko's 4th Ukrainian fronts. Stalin accelerated the schedule once again. The attack would begin on May 6th instead of May 7th. On May 6th, Konev attacked from the north with the 13th Army, the 3rd Guards Army, the 5th Guards Army, and the 3rd and 4th Guards Tank Armies. On the night of May 8th to 9th, Konev ordered Rybalko's and Lelyushenko's tank armies on an 80-kilometer dash to Prague. At dawn, their vanguard detachments entered the city. On May 9, 1945, at 8 a.m., 2 days after the capitulation signed in Reims, and 1 day after the new surrender signed in Berlin-Karlshorst, Soviet tanks were in the center of Prague. In the following days, the Soviets captured or accepted the surrender of more than 600,000 men of Army Group Center. On May 11th, elements of the 4th Guards Tank Army linked up with the US Third Army east of Pilsen. The Second World War in Europe was over. The price: 10 million Soviet casualties. How much did it cost? Definitive estimates on Soviet casualties during World War II have been disputed for decades. The partial opening of Russian archives since the 1990s has allowed for a more precise estimation, although the exact figures will probably never be fully known. The most cited source, and the one used by Glantz and House in their study, When Titans Clashed, states that the total cost of Soviet military casualties during the war was at least 29 million personnel. That number includes those killed in action, dead from wounds, dead from disease, prisoners of war who died in German captivity, and the missing. In the period specifically covered by this script, the Soviet reconquest of Europe from Kursk in July 1943 to Prague in May 1945, the most accepted calculations indicate that the Red Army suffered nearly 10 million casualties, including dead, wounded, and permanently incapacitated. Let's break that down into the milestones we have narrated. Operation Bagration alone, and the associated Lublin-Brest and Lvov-Sandomierz operations, cost 178,507 dead or missing and 587,308 wounded. Nearly 1 out of every 3 of the 2,331,000 combatants involved. The Vistula Oder operation in January 1945 consumed tens of thousands of casualties in 18 days of advance. The Battle of Berlin cost 81,116 dead in 17 days, with another 280,000 wounded. And behind these figures lies the statistic that defines the entire conflict in the East. Of the more than 11 million total German casualties up to April 30th, 1945, nearly 9 million were inflicted on the Eastern Front. Of the 13,488,000 Germans fallen or captured throughout the entire war, 75% of all soldiers mobilized by the Reich, equivalent to 46% of Germany's adult male population in 1939, 10,758,000 fell or were taken prisoner in the East. The tombstones in German cemeteries that read "Gestorben im Osten," died in the East, are no accident. The East was where the Wehrmacht met its destruction. But let us return to the Soviets. Marshal Malinovsky, who commanded the Second Ukrainian Front, described the process of casualty replacement in the final years of the war thus. His recruiting officers followed the advance of the troops, and in newly liberated towns and villages gathered men of military age, many of whom had spent years under German occupation, and incorporated them directly into rifle divisions. A division could grow from 3,800 to 7,000 men in this manner, without any significant improvement in its actual combat power, because the recruits arrived untrained and were thrown into combat within days. That is what explains how the Red Army was able to sustain continuous massive operations between 1943 and 1945, despite having lost nearly 30 million personnel in the total war, a relentless mechanism of human mobilization that turned any service-aged man from any liberated village into a soldier before the corpses from the previous battle were cold. By the summer of 1944, the Soviet Union was scraping the bottom of the barrel of its manpower reserve. Soviet planners knew it. That is why artillery, tanks, and aviation were used in densities that seem almost absurd viewed from the 21st century, to substitute with firepower what could no longer be replaced with bodies. The army that learned tactical and operational transformation. How did the Red Army transform between 1941 and 1945? In June 1941, the Red Army was an organization that in theory had a brilliant doctrine, the deep operation theory of the 1930s, and in practice could not coordinate a regiment on the battlefield. Division commanders distributed their forces evenly along the front without concentrating them at the decisive point. Artillery fired with densities of 7 to 12 tubes per kilometer. Staffs could not maintain basic communications with their subordinates. Political commissars interfered in commanders' tactical decisions for personal career reasons. By the summer of 1944, that same army could do this. Move 5 complete armies, more than 400,000 men with all their heavy equipment, from the Ukrainian front to the Belarusian front in 6 weeks in total secrecy without German intelligence detecting the transfer until the divisions attacked. Concentrate 34,000 artillery pieces in the Bagration sector, a density up to 13 times that of 1941. Coordinate 4 fronts with simultaneous deep objectives, ensuring that each tactical penetration turned into an operational exploitation before the Germans could reorganize. Plan strategic-level deception operations that made German armies reinforce the wrong sectors. This transformation was not a spontaneous miracle. It was the result of a deliberate process. The Stavka had a section of the General Staff dedicated exclusively to the study and dissemination of lessons of war, a systematic Marxist analysis of every battle, operation and campaign. Those lessons were incorporated into new regulations and procedures. Successful commanders were promoted to positions of greater responsibility. Worn-out formations were withdrawn to the rear, re-equipped and recommitted with personnel who had now survived combat. Stalin changed too. In 1941, the dictator tried to manage the war personally, issuing direct orders to army commanders without going through the fronts, countermanding his own generals in moments of crisis, maintaining paranoia as a management tool. In 1942, he began to trust a wider circle. In 1943, the restoration of military commanders' authority over political commissars, decreed on October 9, 1942, was already an established fact. In 1944 and 1945, Stalin basically left the conduct of campaigns to front commanders and their staffs, reserving political and strategic decisions for himself. The contrast with Hitler could not have been more brutal. While Stalin decentralized, Hitler centralized. While Stalin granted greater tactical freedom to his generals, Hitler went so far as to personally design the missions of individual battalions. German commanders who asked permission to withdraw a division to defend themselves better could end up before a court-martial. Those who acted on their own initiative without permission could be shot. The result was a growing leadership asymmetry that contributed as much to Soviet victory as any material factor. The transformation of the map of Europe. The Soviet advance was not only military, it was the reconfiguration of the European political order. Every capital liberated by the Red Army remained in the Soviet orbit. Bucharest, Sofia, Belgrade, Warsaw, Budapest, Vienna, Berlin, Prague. Behind the tank divisions came the political structures. Local party committees trained for years in Soviet exile, national armies that had fought under Soviet command and whose officers were, for the most part, men chosen by Moscow. 2 Polish armies, 3 Romanian armies, 2 Bulgarian armies, a Czech corps, Yugoslav units, all committed to the front in the final 2 years of the war, all formed within the Red Army system, all destined to become the armies of the new satellite states. The conferences of Tehran, November 1943, Yalta, February 1945, and Potsdam, July to August 1945, ratified in diplomacy what the armies had established on the ground. The percentages agreement between Churchill and Stalin in Moscow in October 1944, scribbled on a napkin with proportions of influence for Romania, Bulgaria, Greece, Yugoslavia, and Hungary, was not a complete map, but it was the recognition that whoever had the armies on the ground held the politics. The Soviet Union lost more than 27 million people in the war. It gained the buffer states of Eastern Europe. That trade-off would define world politics for the next 45 years.